Welcome to our lecture today on Indian philosophy, in which I'm going to go over a number of the contexts of Indian philosophy and talk about the different philosophical schools and their relationship to some degree with the Yoga Sutras. This lecture allows a very specific thing. Often people will talk about yoga as not just an exercise, which we've already seen yoga really is an exercise because there was no word for exercise in Sanskrit. But a philosophy. So what do they mean by that philosophy? Well, generally they'll mean something like Sankhya, which we'll be reviewing, of course, today, and something like Bhakti or Eduita Vedanta, which I'll be discussing in just a minute with you. So we are going to do philosophy today, and then we are going to be, for the most part, done talking about abstract philosophy and looking more at practices for the rest of the course. We will have some days where I talk a little bit more about Western thought and Western philosophies and how they relate to modern postural yoga, but that's not today. So let's get that screen shared and get going. Here we go. Presentation mode, here we go. And we are set. So Indian philosophy, and as you note here, I have some Indian philosophers. Actually, these would be Dasnamis, sadhus. The order was supposedly started by Shankaracharya, who's a character that founded Advaita Vedanta. And if you just heard the yip of a pug behind me, that's because I'm upstairs in my living room and the dog is circulating. Yep, there he is, barking right away. So life is good when there's a pug in the house. So what are the topics we're going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about the context of Indian philosophy, sort of like why we're talking about Indian philosophy and what are the stakes of Indian philosophy. I'm going to run over the varied philosophical schools. There are 6 philosophical schools that are called the Darshanas. Then we're going to talk about Advaita Vedanta and Sankhya. Again, I'm giving you a little bit more Sankhya. I just feel like everybody needs a little Sankhya. And finally, we're going to talk about who is this Patanjali, the supposed author of the Yoga Sutras, and more. So in the context of philosophy, what do I mean by the context of philosophy per se? In Indian philosophy, we have these things called the darshanas. So darshanas, and there are 6 of them, comes from the Sanskrit root drish, which means to see. So, or from drish to darshana means something like seeing. So a philosophy is a way of seeing. A philosophy is the way you see the world. Now, as White argues, and I think he's correct on this, Indian philosophy has different stakes from, say, Western thought. In every Indian philosophical system, or darshana, you have sort of a grand theory of everything. It's like a grand unifying theory that will explain everything about human existence, the way the world works, a grand theory of everything. So each philosophical school will have the same type of inquiry that we have in the West when it comes to philosophy. When you're looking at philosophy and religion, especially, and philosophy of religion, you'll see that you have 3 realms of sort of grasping the world. This is how you can divide up the main questions of Western thought. You have ontology, which is an inquiry into being. You have epistemology, which is an inquiry into knowing or learning. And you have metaphysics, I forgot a C there, metaphysics, which is an inquiry into the nature of the world, a theory of physics as opposed to physical science. So ontology, think about this. You're trying to figure out what's the nature of the soul and what's the nature of the world. So your ontology, what does it mean to be in the world and be a human in the world, and what is the world? What is the nature of God? What's the nature of an angel? What is the nature of a plant? What is the nature of a dog? Does a dog have a soul? Epistemology, an inquiry into knowing. Some people say an inquiry into truth, but it's an inquiry into the episteme. An episteme is sort of a means of knowing or a thing known. And finally, metaphysics. It's like a physics of physics. So we look at the world around us, and metaphysics tells us how that world operates. Now, in much of this, and in the Western world, we also have theology, which is an inquiry into divinity, the nature of divinity, not just the nature of who is and what is God, but what is divinity in the world. Now, arguably, Christian theology has been the winner in the West for up until maybe the 19th century. So one thing that I wanted to note is that when we're dealing with Indian philosophy, it's a gnoseology. Remember that term we learned? So it's knowing and perceiving correctly having gnosis, having a transcendent vision. Transcendent vision. What is gnosis? Gnosis is the secret of the universe. So it's understanding the secret of the universe. Gnosiology comes from gnosis, the root gnosis, which is an Indo-European root that is the same as the Sanskrit gna, or also, as we know, knowing, knowledge. So, here in theology, it is about salvation. When you're studying theology, you're trying to figure out how you are saved, notably saved through Christ in the West. Now, there's also salvation through these Indian philosophies. Through any of these darshanas, you will have that Gnostic experience. You will have the Gnostic experience, you will know the secrets of the universe, and by knowing properly, you will see properly. And by seeing properly, sorry, it's a little bit warm, and by seeing properly, you will gain liberation. You will be freed from pain because you will understand the truth. So knowing and perceiving correctly grants salvation. Indian thought also has this idea called Jivan Mukti. Mukti, from moksha, means to be liberated, to be released. Some people would say enlightened. I like released better. And Jivan means while living. So there can be people that attain salvation in this current life. And these would be like sort of saints, saintly figures and gurus and whatnot. So Jivan Mukta would be one who has been liberated while they still live. When you get right down to it, most of the discussions of liberation in most Indian schools posits liberation later, at death or after death, or in a rebirth after death in a heavenly realm where liberation is possible. But some people will talk about this Jivan Mukta, being able to be released through the world. So we have these six different darshanas, and I'll talk about them in a second, a little bit more. The main school that is discussed today is called Eduita Vedanta, and Vedanta means the end of the Vedas, and Advaita means not to. So it's a non-dual system that argues that man and God are essentially one, and the whole universe is an illusion. To see separation is illusion. And if you see through illusion, then you'll be freed, and you'll no longer have suffering. So like I had said, darshana comes from the root to see, but what is it that you see? Do you see the truth? Do you see the world? Do you see yourself? These are things to think about when you think about this word darshana. So in addition to the darshanas, we have a couple of other religions. Namely, we have Buddhism, we have Jainism, and Islam. So arguably, when you talk about Indian philosophy, you should be thinking about Buddhism, Islam, and Jainism. So I'll give you an overview of those in just a second. So why do we need to learn all of this philosophy? Well, it's to understand the philosophy that is often packaged with yoga. So when somebody says yoga is not a religion, it's a philosophy, well, what's the philosophy they're talking about? They're usually pretty loosey-goosey on that philosophy. Okay, so there are 6 darshanas, and I'll go through these in detail in just a second. Well, not too much detail. We don't need it all. So starting around the 16th century, people who were writing about Indian philosophy began to organize all of the scriptures into 6 philosophical schools. Now, all these schools would have existed before the 16th century, but they were only organized this way in the 16th century. So once upon a time, in say the 5th century, somebody would just say they're into Mimamsa. They wouldn't say Mimamsa amongst the other 6 visions of the world, the 6 darshanas. Okay, so yeah, there are many philosophical schools, and they're organized in these viewpoints to understand them. Nyaya is logic or analytical philosophy. Vaisheshika says that you can understand the atomic structure, by which I don't mean the structure of radiation, but understand the very atoms that make up the world. If you understand that, these various very tiny building blocks of being, then you'll understand the world. Mimamsa is a critical interpretation of the Vedas, the main scriptures of Hinduism. Vedanta is the essence or the end of the Veda, the fulfillment of the Vedas. Then you have Sankhya, which is usually grouped with yoga. Okay, so what is this Mimamsa? It sounds a little bit like mimosa, but it's a Mimamsa, not a mimosa. So Mimamsa first off argues that you have the Vedas. The Vedas are scriptures. There's 4 of them: the Rig Veda, the Yajurveda, the Samaveda, and the Atharva Veda. So these are 4 specific sets of scriptures that are revealed. They're thought to be apaurushaya, which means authorless. So the ones who wrote down the Vedas are the ones who just witnessed them in the world, who just sort of saw them. In fact, these figures are called rishis, the ones who see the Vedas. So these are the handbooks for the earliest rituals of the sacrificial cults and the earliest of proto-Hindu religions. They're generally about offerings that you make into fires. There are about cutting up sacrificial animals. There are very complicated speculations on how to perform very engaged, very detailed rituals. And what Mimamsa does, it says, if you want to understand the truth, you can find it in these scriptures. So you can find it in not only performing these rituals in these scriptures, but in by studying the scriptures and really unlocking the various truths that are in studying the scriptures. So all knowledge comes from the Vedas. Vedas comes from the Sanskrit root vid, which means to know, but also means to find or to see, from which we get the Indo-European, well, we get Indo-European root is vid, but we have the word video, as in I saw it on video. So moving on to the next one, Nyaya. Nyaya is an epistemology and a study of truth and logic. So Nyaya says, how do we know things? Let's take a minute and try to figure out how things come to be known and what is valid meaning. They actually say what is pramana, a valid means of cognition, and apramana. What is it? Do we trust our sense objects? How do our senses work? Do we trust the syllogism, A to B, B to C, A equals C? So it's really getting into this epistemological debate of how do we know things. And Nyaya will use logic to resolve all these sort of philosophical problems. Vaisheshika is the one I understand the least. It's often described as atomism, and it means it's different than philosophy, or it's different than Vaisheshika, or well, it's different than Nyaya, where it's logic and epistemology. Here it's more of like a metaphysics, where you're just trying to break, and a metaphysics and an ontology, where you're trying to just break down everything. So wood is, to use the classical example from the West, where does fire come from? Fire lives within wood. We know this because if you touch fire to wood, more fire releases. So atomism is in like, if you get and understand what everything is made of, how you balance all the elements, then you'll understand the world. Again, you don't need to know all of this. I just want to give you an exposure to it so you understand what are like the stakes of Indian philosophy. Sankhya. Well, we've talked about Sankhya before. It's dualism. Its name means Sankhya, means the enumeration school. Remember, we talked about Purusha, which is spirit. The Purushas are enumerable. And you have Prakriti. Prakriti is various. Prakriti is one thing, but it's manifesting in all sorts of ways. Spirit becomes convinced that it's locked in with nature. But once it realizes it's separate from nature, then it will no longer be suffering and no longer deal with the pains of being in nature. And I put up this lovely little comic of Mr. Master Blaster, a character from the Mad Max universe, and you can see him in Beyond Thunderdome. That's probably the worst of the Mad Max movies. But anyway, Master Blaster is not unlike this metaphor we have of Sankhya, which is the soul is seeing and has knowledge and cognition, but the body is blind. It's just a body. So Purusha is like the spirit, and it's stuck with Prakriti. It can know things, but it can't do anything. Prakriti is like the body that makes and carries Purusha around. The goal is to dissolve any identification of the soul with nature, to be free. Now, we're on to Eduita Vedanta. Oh, I forgot to mention here. I don't even have a slide for it. So Sankhya in the 6 darshanas, I'm just going to get to them and you'll be like, that's 5. Well, because they have Sankhya and yoga. And traditionally in the 16th century, they said Sankhya goes together with yoga. So they would say that yoga is the method of meditation and contemplation and whatnot that can affect the ends of Sankhya. So Sankhya could also be called Sankhya Yoga. All right, so Vedanta, here we are, and I'll go through this in more detail in a minute because it's Eduita Vedanta. So Eduita Vedanta has become probably the predominant form of Indian philosophy. And the majority of sort of yoga teachers that'll talk about a yoga philosophy probably should be talking about Sankhya, but they don't. They talk a lot about Advaita Vedanta because Advaita Vedanta really won out. And so when the 6 darshanas were set out in the 16th century, the guys who were setting them out and organizing them that put Advaita Vedanta at the end, obviously had an agenda, and that was to set up that their philosophical system was the best. So Advaita, not two. Dvaita. Dvaita means dual or two. Means not two. It's non-dualism. Vedanta, Vedanta, the end or the culmination of the Vedas. Now, why do I have these Sanskrit words on the right? Tat tvam asi. Tat tvam asi. This is what's called a Mahavakya, a great saying. In fact, it's probably one of the greatest sayings in Indian philosophy. Tat tvam asi means that, tat, thou, or you, tvam, art. Asi, that thou art. You are that. Very quickly. There is Brahman, God, complete totality. Then there is Atman. Atman is the individual version of God in the world. When Atman realizes he is Brahman, that's when liberation happens. And you are Brahman. You think you are just this individual little jiva, this little soul. But in reality, that is only illusion. Once you realize that your core being is God, and that the only thing that's keeping you from seeing that is illusion, and illusion has the Sanskrit word maya. Maya means illusion, the thing that is measured out. Once that illusion is dissolved, you'll realize you are that, and you've always been that all along. So this was started in the 8th century by a guy named Shankaracharya. And now it's the most celebrated form of Indian philosophy. Now we have some other schools or other religions that I think are important to talk about. We have Jainism, Buddhism, Islam, and then we have 2 other groups within Hinduism, and I don't have one on here, but Bhakti and Tantra. So what is Buddhism? Buddhism was founded by the Buddha around 500 BCE. Buddha means the enlightened one, and or the awakened one. What is the main argument of Buddhism? You can find it in the 4 noble truths. And these are these 4 noble truths. The first is dukkha. Dukkha means suffering. There is suffering. All life is suffering. The Buddha starts out as all life is suffering. All life is unsatisfactory and impermanent. This means that no matter how much you feel happy because you found the love of your life, that person's going to die. No matter how much you found the best song you've ever heard, that's going to end. No matter how full you feel, you're going to be hungry again. No matter how rested you feel, you'll be tired. There is no end to the pains of life, and eventually you will die, and it will be awful. So some people think that this truth of dukkha is really pessimistic. But in reality, as we'll see, it can be quite joyful. Once you understand the first noble truth of dukkha, then you can stop trying to cling to things and make them permanent. When you just enjoy things and then they go away and you know they're going to go away and you stop clinging to them and try to make the permanent into the impermanent, then you will do a little bit better. So that leads us to the second noble truth. The origin of pain, the origin of this unsatisfactoriness, of this dukkha, is clinging to the unsatisfactory or the impermanent. Trying to make that which is transitory permanent will never happen because it's always changing. If anyone who's been in love will know this. Finally, there is an end. There is an end to dukkha, and that is nirvana, which means the extinguishing. That means one stops suffering because they have stopped clinging to the world. Stop trying to make your life eternal. Your life is not eternal. There is one guarantee in life. You will die. No one here gets out alive. Finally, there's the Eightfold Path. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but that's That's Buddhism. Buddhism is the path of Buddhism, the Eightfold Path, a way of right living and right practice so that you can gain nirvana. Now, don't get too excited here. I heard a Tibetan Lama one time was asked, how many people have been enlightened in, the last 3,000 years? He said, about 60. And there's a great book called Is Enlightenment Even Possible? I'm kind of the feeling that enlightenment isn't possible, but, it's up to you. So is liberation while living possible? I don't know. I've never met a liberated person. I've met a lot of people who have said they were liberated. Surely we're not. Okay, so there is one other aspect of Buddhism that I think is really important, and that's that it is anatma. Atma, from the root means to breathe, to breathe. So the self, atma, the self. So if the self is not real, if there is no Aaron here, if there is no Dr. Ulrich actually here, well, what is this all singing, all dancing goofball that's running around and picking stuff up and putting things down and eating things and going to the bathroom and falling in love and, writing books and giving lectures? What is this thing? Well, Buddhism posits that this thing that we think we are is actually 5 things called skandhas. Skandha just means a heap, like a pile. So you're really a pile of skandhas. Hey, you pile of skandha. So what are these 5 heaps? Well, let's see if we can find them together. Well, what do I know about me? I got a body. That's one thing that makes up this. Got a body. What else do I have? I have my emotions. I have my feelings. I can definitely sense those. How do I feel? I mean, do I feel sad? Do I feel happy? What are my pains? I can see them running through my body. Then I also have my thoughts, my mind stream, my intellect, this constant chitter chatter, blah, 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 that's going on all in my head. Then you also have your karmas. Now, we've heard this word karma before in the Western world. People usually think it means, oh, well, you do good, you get good, you do bad, you get bad. That's not really what karma is about. Karma comes from a Sanskrit root that means kri, from which we also have another Indo-European root, create. So you're to create. Karma, and here particularly they're talking about your karmic trajectory, is the tendencies of things you do. So if I am a professor in this life, in the next life, I'm probably going to be a writer. I'm going to be somebody that reads. I might not be a professor. I might be doing Lord knows what I might be doing. So what we understand here is what we do is what we tend to do. So if you tend to do shitty things, you're going to be around shitty people and shitty things are going to happen to you. So it's less that I do a thing and a thing happens back to me and there's balance. It's that the more I do things, the more I'm going to keep doing things. They would argue if you meditate a lot in this life, you'll meditate a lot in the next life. So whatever you're doing right now, do stuff you want to keep doing because you're going to keep doing it forever. And then finally, your consciousness, your chit. And this is where it gets a little loose, gets a little loosey-goosey. But they say chit is like your raw awareness that is not your body, not your thoughts, not your mind, not your karmas. It's like a candle. And you take that candle and there's a flame on the candle and you put it on another candle. That's it. The spark of consciousness that goes from life to life. I always thought this could be kind of like a soul, but whatever. So the spark of consciousness is all that really survives. And it is carried by the winds of karma as if into another life doing the same sort of stuff. And nirvana is the extinguishing. That's as if that candle just gets blown out. So in all of this, there is no self. There is no permanent self. I mean, my body is constantly changing from, shaving one day to being beardless the other to watching my body die, which is happening all the time. Time and life is a cooker and it's cooking us all. Your emotions or feelings, well, those aren't lasting. I mean, and then your thoughts, your mind stream, well, those change all the time too. And the idea is you're going to leave all of those things behind when you die. I'm intrigued by the Christian notion of a soul and a heaven because it really seems like you just leave your body behind. And then like in the notion of a Christian heaven, it's like your emotions and your thought continuum seem to just continue for all time. Okay, so the argument is in these, because you're just all of these 5 skandhas, there's no permanent Dr. Ulrich here, then there is no permanent self, no soul. All right, Jainism. Jainism was created by a group about the same time as the Buddha, and the main character is named Mahavir. So Mahavir was actually a little bit older than the Buddha, and the Buddha probably hung out with a bunch of Jains. Now, Jainism, also Buddhism, no gods. Notice no gods? No gods. There's no God. There are godlike figures that are considered perfected beings, but no God created the world. What happens is the world exists, and Buddhism has the same idea. The world exists, and then it deconstructs, and then it starts again on its own. It's all mechanical. There's no will of God creating the world. There might be many gods born, but they also die, and they didn't make all of this, and they cannot give you salvation. Now, Jains have an argument that karma is a little different. For Jains, karma is any action you do. The worst karmas are the ones that cause violence. Karma gets on your soul like a sticky goo. Not unlike Sankhya's notion of Purusha, you have the self that is considered fully luminous, and then due to actions throughout innumerable lifetimes and into an infinite past and future, you have all of this sticky goo all over your soul. And through good actions and through meditation, you can remove that sticky goo to reveal the perfect self-luminous thing that you are. Very similar to Sankhya. Remember here, there's no Purusha here. No Purusha. Purusha. So materialist karma. Jains are really interesting because they have posited an absolute non-violence, where even the monks will walk around sweeping in front of themselves so as to not step on a bug, and they'll wear masks to keep from accidentally breathing in a bug. They are absolute vegetarians, and they also believe in not eating like potatoes or carrots, because when you harvest those plants, you kill the plant. So they would be more like, so it's better to eat like a tomato, because you don't kill the plant when you eat the tomato, or an apple, you don't kill the tree when you eat the apple. And some Jains, not a lot, but some people still do this, they'll practice what's called salekana, in which they progressively do fewer and fewer actions and eat less and less food until they starve to death. Kind of intense. Islam. So Islam is, of course, a religion, from the West, from the Middle Eastern world. And it's more like 6th century, 6th, 7th century. And the main argument in Islam is there is no God but God. All right, God. We got a God who created the world and has got it all under control. And there is a soul, and your soul is saved effectively by your allegiance and submission to God. And when you die, you go to heaven if you have submitted to God and become a Muslim. So there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, peace be upon him. So that is the main argument. There is a truth. That truth is Islam, as revealed by Muhammad. There are lots of other prophets, but the Islam of Muhammad is the most complete revelation possible. And the goal is to absolutely submit to God. Now, they have yoga, in fact. I was just reading this text that, I can't remember the date on it, though. It's a commentary and repackaging of the Yoga Sutras for the Islamic world that's written in Persian. The Yoga Sutras got to Iran, what is now Iran. So why would they have yoga? They actually have yoga, and you can find kind of schools of yoga in India, in Indian Islam, and in Sufi, in which yoga is used as a way of connecting further to God. This is mostly through meditation and chanting. It's not through bendy bodies. All right, back to Hinduism. Bhakti. We're back to a soul. What is bhakti? Bhakti comes from the root bhaj, which means to share. The idea is that you are sharing with God, but you're also partaking and sharing in the glory and joy of knowing God and communing with God. This form of devotionalism really gets going in the 14th century with a figure named Chaitanya, who was so enraptured with love with Krishna that he would actually become Krishna and sometimes become Krishna's wife. Well, actually his girlfriend, Radha. And sometimes he would even become Radha in order to enjoy the pleasure of having sex and making love to the great god Krishna. It's really emotional. Bhakti is about bringing up all of your emotions and you're just thinking of God and being devoted to God. Many Hindu bhaktas that I know are so devoted to God that they'll have a home altar, and before they cook food. They'll offer the food and say a prayer to God. Or I remember my friend Usha, when someone had brought her flowers, she went and said, I'm going to give this to God first. And she took the flowers and she held them up before her image of God, and then went and put them in a vase. But it was important that she shares it with God first. So the goal is to be near God and attain a heavenly state when you are with God. One famous critique of Eduita Vedanta, which I will be talking about soon enough a little bit more, is I want to taste sugar, not be sugar. I don't want to become God. I don't want to become God. I want to enjoy the pleasures of knowing God and loving God. And in practice, what does bhakti come to? It's going to temples, and it's an awful lot of singing these emotional songs called bhajans. There's bhaj again, in which you just, how to explain a bhajan? They are awesome. So if you are at a Hindu temple and people start singing, they'll usually be singing bhajan. And if they start singing a line and you're singing back, then it gets going and it go faster and faster until you get into like sort of a trance almost and feel this ecstasy. So when the Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murare Enata Narayana Vasudeva. So if you start singing that in a group and then you start getting it really fast, Shri Krishna Govinda Hare. Now they'll start with Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murare Narayana Vasudeva. And you can sing for hours, slowly getting faster and faster until you're just chanting and singing in a frenzy. And that is bhakti, feeling the glory of being near and praising and even playing with God. Now, Tantra. Tantra is a mode of Hinduism that is also found in Buddhism and Jainism that argues rituals can bring about salvation. Rituals can even are thought to be able to bring about salvation in one lifetime. In fact, these rituals are quite complicated and they use sort of every means possible, including transgressive sexuality. And these aren't having sex to have everlasting orgasms. It's having sex with someone you're not supposed to, usually someone from a different caste that would be impure. And in the context of that sexuality, in which you're doing a sexualized ritual, the ritual will have sex in it, but it's really more about the ritual than the sex. You're supposed to find purity in the impure. They'll also consume impure substances like intoxicants. Famously, they drink wine. They're said to partake in the so-called 5 M's, which are madhu, which is liquor, matsya, which is fish, mansa, which is meat, mudra, which we still don't know, parched kidney beans maybe, and maituna, which is ritualized sex. So the goal here is to do these things that are bad, or are considered, not really bad, but are considered impure. And through performing and engaging in the impure and find purity in it, you will see that the divine is in everything. The world is not an illusion. The world is the full condensation and transformation of the divine into the world. So everything you do is interacting with the divine, and everything about you is the divine. Everything is God. So in Eduita Vedanta, we'll say the trick to understanding illusion is if you look at a rope in the yard and say, it's a snake, and you run away, when someone holds it up and it's a rope, you're no longer afraid. That's seeing through illusion. That's seeing through what they call Maya. I argue that Tantra is a little different. In Tantra, you see a rope and you pick it up and it's a snake. So Tantra would be an explosive understanding of the sacred that happens in all things. That's a quick read on Tantra. That's a quick read on Bhakti. It's a quick read on everything. Okay, so when we're talking about philosophy, we got to remember that Indian philosophy is about soteriology. Philosophy causes salvation, but philosophy is complicated. So the texts that they're writing in are mostly in Sanskrit. Sanskrit, as White writes, is this perfected language. And despite it being perfect, it's really hard. I know he writes somewhere else that he's like, I've been reading this for 40 years and it's still hard. And I find Sanskrit, even though I teach Sanskrit, it's very difficult. So the texts being written in Sanskrit are confusing. I mean, even look at the Yoga Sutras. Remember how there are those short little statements? So you need other texts written about those texts that will explain things. Those are what are called commentaries. Because Sanskrit is so baffling, this is what White writes on page 25. This is what made commentaries so vitally necessary. In order to demonstrate that the axioms of a given philosophical system were valid, the technical language of those axioms had to be analyzed in hair-splitting detail. So every one of these philosophical texts from the darshanas will have extensive commentaries. And the interesting thing is the commentaries, as White shows us, have an agenda. So the majority of the commentaries on the Yoga Sutras are influenced by Eduita Vedanta or Sankhya. The Yoga Sutras were originally a pretty Sankhya source, but later it's become really heavily interpreted by Advaita Vedanta and actually by Bhakti. There's quite a few people that will argue everything in the Yoga Sutras can be resolved with purely understanding Bhakti. Remember, there's this one line in the Yoga Sutras, I don't know if you remember it, that says, there is a means to liberation, that is the Lord of Yoga, Yogeshwar, and his sacred syllable is Om. So the argument there is devotion to God could be devotion to Yogeshwara, which could be, in that way, yoga is interpreted as a path of devotion. Oh. I guess I don't have slides for this. Let's go back for a quick second here, and I want to talk about Sankhya one more time. So remember, Sankhya is dualist. While the Purushas may be multiple, all Prakriti, which includes the minds of each person, is singular. The Purusha, nature, is pure, luminous, independent. Now, when we were talking about Prakriti or nature is unconscious. The only real consciousness is Purusha. Prakriti is mechanical. It's just that combination of those gunas that the senses, which are also made up of those gunas, contact and come back and reveal themselves for the Purusha to experience. So when we're thinking about Purusha, sort of mind or chitta is the key. Mind is the bridge between Purusha and Prakriti. It takes the form of the ego, so the ahamkara. So when I said that, you may remember me saying that Prakriti when it's the senses, it goes out through your ears, touches the thing that's making the noise and brings it back. But it has been altered. Your senses have been altered by going out and coming back, and you bring it back and it shows it to Purusha. So if you know the true nature of the mind through meditation and contemplation, then according to Sankhya, the Purusha comes to see itself as it really is, and the turnings of the mind cease, chitta, vritti, nirodha. So to get to experience this true nature, one has to meditate and work through understanding understanding nature to understand what Purusha really is through meditation. Now, White has this lovely phrase that you read today that says that at this liberation point where Purusha realized Prakriti is there, with this, and he writes this on page 29, with this, nature has left the stage, and with nothing left to view, her spectator, no longer subject to the filtering or distorting effects of the mind stuff, becomes aware of his isolation from the activities of the material world, and he dwells in his own form. Because of the nature of mind stuff, all this mind stuff that's going on, and the Purusha, once the self has stopped realizing it is the mind stuff, then Prakriti can go and do anything. It doesn't matter. But Purusha remains. However, here's the trick. Magic powers. If you fully understand Purusha, you'll understand how those powers operate or how that mind stuff works. What I mean to say is this. If you understand how the senses go out, contact things, then come back, you can then manipulate those senses and you can send out your own power and will through your senses to alter the world, to gain knowledge of other things, even to manipulate other things. So, finally, Advaita Vedanta is different because in the yoga systems, Purusha and Prakriti are real. Advaita Vedanta says they're not real. Purusha and Prakriti are not real at all. They're only illusion. In reality, there is only one thing. that one thing is God. And you are that. You just don't realize because of illusion. I remember one of my first teachers, John Grimes, telling this story about meeting someone I found out later was actually a guru of mine. And so John Grimes enters this guy's sort of house in California, or a place where he's staying. And this guy bustles John into this room. And he says, "Who you?" Because he doesn't really speak English well. And Grimes says, "Oh, I'm a graduate student." And he goes, "Bus." And Hindi, "Bus means stop it." And he says, "Who you?" And John Grimes like, "My name's John. I'm an American." "Bus." Wouldn't take that either. "Who you?" It's like, "I'm a devotee of this guru." "Bus." Just wouldn't take it. And finally, John Grimes says, "I am Atman." And this guy, Muktananda, just kind of looks at him and goes, like that. And that's an Indian mudra that means kind of like what we have it mean, but it's not a white power symbol, is it's A-okay. It's a blessing. And in fact, when I was at this same guru who I'm talking about here at one of his ashrams in India, I remember seeing a picture of him going like this. And somebody turned to me and said, "Oh, you know what that is? It's man and God are one outside of the three gunas." Sankhya. There's always a little Sankhya somewhere. So Maya, or illusion, establishes this false disconnection. There is no real disconnection. Everything is just one. Tattvamasi, that thou art. So in Sankhya, the difference between Purusha and Prakriti are real. In Eduita Vedanta, difference is only illusory. Tattvamasi, that thou art. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause for a second, and we are going, and then I'll get back to you all with, I'll just give you a second video so you can watch too. Okie dokie. So take a break, and I'll come back and finish this lecture. See you soon.